It started with a scream. Not a loud one, but the kind that cut straight through the noise of a crowded emergency ward. A small boy, barely 5 years old, lay on a gurney, his chest rising and falling like a machine on the verge of shutting down. Monitors beeped like nervous heartbeats, each sound a reminder that time was running out. Doctors and nurses moved in a blur, sweat shining on their foreheads under the harsh fluorescent lights. There was no ventilator left. Every machine in the hospital had already been claimed. A nurse grabbed a manual resuscitation bag, her hands squeezing rhythmically, fighting to keep oxygen flowing into tiny lungs. Minutes turned into hours. The room, once loud with chaos, grew quiet except for the hiss of air and the soft grunt of exhausted hands. 4 hours. That's how long they kept going. 4 hours before human strength began to fail. And then it happened. The kind of mistake no one talks about in public. Hands grew weak. A rhythm faltered. A breath missed its beat. A young boy's life hung on a thin, fragile thread. I watched from the corner of the room, my heart pounding, my own hands trembling from fatigue. I was a doctor, trained to save lives, but in that moment, I felt helpless, not because of lack of knowledge, but because the human body has limits. The cruel irony was unbearable. The science to keep this child alive existed, yet a simple lack of machines meant we might lose him anyway. That night, as the sun threatened to rise over the city, an idea took root. Quiet, almost ridiculous in its simplicity. What if a small device could do what exhausted hands could not? What if a machine could safely squeeze that bag, keep oxygen flowing, and give doctors back their most valuable resource? Time. I sketched it in the margins of my patient charts. Rough lines, childish drawings, a box with a lever, a battery, a soft mechanical hand to keep breathing when human hands couldn't. I didn't tell anyone at first. The idea felt too fragile, too absurd. In a place where resources were scarce and every penny counted, who would fund a doctor's half-awake dream? But eventually I told someone. I told the hospital director. He laughed. Not the polite chuckle of someone humoring a bad idea. A real, belly-deep laugh, the kind that dismisses a person as much as their thought. "Doctor," he said, "we're here to treat patients, not build toys. Do you think you're the first person to imagine a clever gadget in the middle of the night? Medicine is serious work. Leave the tinkering to engineers." And that was it. A door closed, a seed crushed under the heel of authority. But some seeds grow in the dark. What he didn't know, what no one in that building could have guessed, was that the very toy he mocked would become the silent guardian in emergency rooms across the country. That the invention laughed out of one hospital would one day hum quietly at the bedside of thousands of patients, each breath a quiet reminder that sometimes the world's most powerful tools begin as someone's most embarrassing idea. Before we go any further, let me pause to ask you something. If stories like this inspire you, if you believe in the quiet, relentless power of human imagination, take a second to subscribe to this channel. You don't want to miss what comes next, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about saving lives. It's about fighting through ridicule, standing alone when everyone says you're wasting your time, and proving that sometimes the impossible isn't impossible at all. This is the story of how one night, one child, and one moment of despair turned into a miracle machine, a device born from exhaustion, built on hope, mocked into existence, and now quietly saving lives you'll never read about in headlines. And it all began with a laugh. As rarely arrive with trumpets. They creep in quietly, often when we're at our weakest, when the body is tired but the mind refuses to sleep. That night, after the boy finally stabilized, I sat alone in the on-call room, staring at the wall like it might whisper answers. My shirt clung to my skin, soaked with sweat and fear. My hands still ached from hours of squeezing that bag. And in the back of my mind, a single thought looped over and over again like a song you can't turn off. We have the knowledge. We have the tools. We just don't have enough of them. I couldn't shake the image of the boy's father. He had stood silently by the bed, watching strangers fight for his child's life, his hands twitching, desperate to help but powerless to do so. His eyes said what his mouth never dared, "Please don't stop." And yet, we almost did. Not because of ignorance, not because of incompetence, but because there simply weren't enough ventilators to go around. That injustice burned like acid in my chest. Medicine, for all its brilliance, still failed in places where money was scarce, where supply never met demand. And I knew this wasn't just about our hospital. This story played out every day in hospitals around the world. Babies, trauma victims, pneumonia patients, all suffocating not because their conditions were untreatable, but because someone else got the last machine. I thought of the resuscitation bag, that simple plastic balloon we squeezed for hours. It was almost mocking in its simplicity. A child's toy in appearance, but in reality, a fragile bridge between life and death. It required no electricity, no complicated software, just hands. Strong, steady, tireless hands. Hands we didn't have. That was when the absurd question slipped through. Why not replace the hands? It was so obvious I almost laughed at myself. Replace the hands. Not with another doctor, not with another nurse, but with something that never tires, never loses rhythm, never hesitates. I grabbed a scrap of paper, the back of a lab request form, and started to draw. The first sketch looked like a child's art project: a box, a hinge, a lever pressing on the bag in a slow, steady rhythm. Air in, air out, again, 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 a heartbeat of plastic and steel. The next few nights were worse than insomnia. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Could it be built cheaply? Could it be safe? Could it run on a battery if the power failed? Every question was a spark, and every spark lit a fire. I scavenged the hospital's storage rooms, searching for parts no one would miss. I studied the way machines compressed ventilator bags in intensive care, then stripped the idea down to its skeleton. I wasn't trying to compete with expensive ventilators. I was trying to build a bridge, something so simple, so obvious, that even the poorest hospital could afford it. I ran my hand over the first crude model like a proud but cautious parent. It was ugly. A Frankenstein of scrap metal, rubber bands, and salvaged motor parts. It looked more like a science fair disaster than a medical device. But in my heart, it pulsed with possibility. The first time it squeezed a bag, it felt like watching a baby take its first breath, clumsy, imperfect, but alive. I tested it on dummies first, then on test lungs, carefully tracking volumes, pressures, rhythms. I built, adjusted, rebuilt. Every improvement taught me something new. Not just about the machine, but about perseverance. And yet, a voice kept creeping in. No one will take this seriously. Hospitals trust only what is proven, certified, sterilized, approved by layers of bureaucracy. Who would trust a homemade contraption? Who would dare put a life on the line with it? I was still just one doctor, not a manufacturer, not a company, not a name people recognized. But the alternative was unbearable. To keep watching people die simply because we lacked enough machines. So I decided to risk the humiliation. I decided to show it to the one person whose opinion could either bury it forever or give it a fighting chance. The hospital director. Before I go on, let me ask you. If you had an idea, something small, unpolished, a thing you believed could save lives, but the people in charge might laugh in your face, would you still bring it forward? Would you risk the ridicule to chase the miracle? Drop your answer in the comments below. I'm curious how many of you would take that leap, because that leap changed everything. Courage isn't a roar. Sometimes it's a whisper in a quiet hallway, a deep breath before you knock on a door you'd rather avoid. That morning, my whisper told me to walk into the director's office with a cardboard box and a heart pounding like a trapped bird. He didn't look up right away. He was busy with charts, signing forms, the usual endless paperwork of a man running a hospital that never slept. When he finally raised his eyes, they landed first on the box, then on me. "What's that?" he asked, a half smile already forming, like he'd seen this play before. I explained, carefully at first, then with urgency. I described the problem: overworked staff, not enough ventilators, children and adults dying not from disease but from delay. I told him about the boy, the 4 hours, the fatigue that nearly stole a life from a family. Then I showed him the device, a simple motor pressing a resuscitation bag in perfect rhythm. For a second, he said nothing, just stared at it, then at me, then back at the device, like trying to decide whether I was serious or insane. And then he laughed, not cruelly, exactly, but dismissively. The kind of laugh that says, "This conversation is already over." He leaned back, shook his head, and sighed. "Doctor," he said, "I admire your enthusiasm. I started to doubt myself. But this is a hospital, not an engineering lab. A fantasy. We treat patients. Maybe the director was right. We don't build gadgets in our spare time. But even if we did, a stop sign. Do you have any idea how much red tape, how many regulations, how many certifications it would take before we could even think about using something like that on a human being?" Her own arms. He wasn't wrong about their own heart breaking. But it wasn't just bureaucracy. I heard about what you tried to show the director. It was disbelief. She said, "Don't stop." He didn't think something that simple could make a difference. That simple encouragement. He didn't think it was worth the trouble. Fire. He didn't think even one person believed. Maybe others. I tried to fight for it. Maybe I wasn't. I talked about the cost of ventilators, how rural hospitals began refining the device, how emergencies outnumbered machines every single day. So I traded favors. I explained how the device wasn't meant to replace proper ventilators, just to keep patients alive long enough to reach one. Be careful. He waved me off. If administration finds out, they might suspend you, he said. And get some rest. Don't like risks. You've been through a long night. They were right. The last thing we need is a tired doctor playing Invention. I wasn't trying to make headlines. That dismissal stung worse than the laughter. It wasn't just rejection. It was a command to stop success, to shrink back into the director's office, to accept that the system was broken and that fixing it wasn't my job. But something inside me wouldn't let the next chapter of this journey. Every time I walked through the ward, every time I saw a family, have you ever had someone laugh at your idea? Every time a monitor flatlined before we could secure a ventilator, I saw the machine in my bones that they were quiet, steady, doing the work exhausted hands. Tell me in the comments what kept you going. Because sometimes what keeps us moving forward isn't proof, it's the quiet refusal to give up. Progress doesn't announce itself with victory parades. Most of the time, it crawls forward in silence, hidden in late nights and lonely workbenches, disguised as failure after failure after failure. I worked when the wards were quiet. Between shifts, I snuck into unused rooms or storage areas, anywhere I could spread out wires and motors without drawing attention. Every sound of approaching footsteps sent a jolt through me. If anyone from administration found me tinkering with unauthorized medical devices, they could suspend me or worse. But the alternative haunted me more. Doing nothing. Watching another child gasp while waiting for a machine that might never come. So I kept going. The first prototype failed in spectacular fashion. The motor jammed after 10 minutes, overheated, and snapped the lever arm clean in two. My second attempt compressed the bag unevenly, sometimes too little, sometimes too much. Dangerous either way. My third model leaked air at every joint. I was patching holes with tape and prayer, knowing that good enough would never be good enough when a human life was at stake. Every problem solved revealed two more. I needed the device to be portable, battery-powered, safe for hours of continuous use, cheap enough that no administrator could claim cost as an excuse, and above all, it had to be idiot-proof. Hospitals aren't kind to fragile tools. If it couldn't survive a fall from a gurney or a power outage in a storm, it wasn't worth building. Money, of course, became the next wall. I wasn't funded, I wasn't sponsored. I was burning through what little I had, skipping meals, skipping rent payments, borrowing from friends I couldn't tell the truth to. My parents thought I was exhausted from the hospital. They didn't know I was also working another full-time job in secret, fighting for lives that hadn't yet been lost. Relationships began to fray. Friends stopped calling. My world shrank to two realities: patients during the day, prototypes at night. I became a ghost in my own life, a man defined not by rest or laughter, but by stubborn hope and mechanical failure. One night, as I sat staring at another broken piece of plastic, a quiet knock came at the door. It was the nurse who had encouraged me before, in her hands, a small bag of food. "You look like hell," she said softly, setting it down. "Eat, and let me help." That moment changed everything. Until then, it had been just me, drowning in a sea of problems I couldn't fix fast enough. Now, I had an ally, someone who could keep watch, fetch supplies, keep morale alive when mine began to crack. Soon after, a junior engineer from the hospital's maintenance department joined us, intrigued by the challenge. He brought tools I didn't have, skills I desperately needed. The team grew, not by numbers, but by heart. 3 people, bound not by pay or prestige, but by a stubborn belief that something simple could be something powerful. We tested relentlessly. We measured airflow with borrowed instruments, logged every variable, squeeze strength, timing, durability under stress. We simulated worst-case scenarios, dropped it, tilted it, ran it until batteries died, because if this thing failed in the middle of a crisis, it wouldn't just cost a patient their life, it would prove every skeptic right. And the skeptics were watching, even if they didn't say so. I caught whispers in the hallways. Still playing with his toy? He should be studying, not pretending to be an engineer. Laughter echoed from closed offices. The sound meant for me even when my name wasn't spoken. It hurt. I won't lie. Some nights, I sat in the dark and wondered if they were right, if I had become a fool chasing a fantasy, if I was building not a miracle, but a monument to my own arrogance. But every time that thought came, I saw the boy's father in my mind, that helpless, pleading gaze, and I remembered the promise I had silently made. Never again. Not if I could help it. Eventually, after dozens of iterations, a version emerged that felt different, sturdy, predictable, safe. It didn't jam, it didn't leak. It delivered breath after breath at exactly the pressure and timing we needed. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. We ran it for 12 hours straight, watching, timing, measuring. No errors, no overheating, no surprises. When it finally stopped, it wasn't because it failed, it was because the batteries, as designed, had simply run out. For the first time, I let myself believe this wasn't just a dream. This was a tool, a real, usable, life-saving tool. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt the weight of a new terror. The only test left was the one that mattered most: a human being. And no ethics board on Earth was going to approve a homemade machine. I didn't know it yet, but fate was already arranging the moment that decision would be forced upon me, a moment that would test not just my invention, but my courage, my career, and my very soul. Before I take you into that moment, into the night everything changed, I want to ask you to hit the like button if you're still with me on this journey. Not just because it helps the channel, but because every click tells me you believe these stories matter, that persistence matters, that sometimes even a whispered "what if" can rewrite the ending. It was a storm that brought the test to us. Not a metaphorical one. A real, howling, merciless storm that tore down power lines and turned our city into a blackout maze. I was on call that night, the hospital lit only by backup generators that groaned under the weight of too many machines demanding too much power. The ER was chaos, the kind of chaos that strips away titles, pride, hesitation. Nurses sprinted between rooms, alarms screamed in mechanical panic, and then the gurney rolled in. A boy, 7 years old. Pneumonia had devoured his lungs, his oxygen levels were dropping like a stone in dark water. Normally we'd have him on a ventilator in minutes, but the storm had fried 2 circuits, and the last functioning ventilator was already in use. I remember the attending physician's voice, raw and shaking. "Manual ventilation," he barked, and a nurse grabbed a bag valve mask, the same plastic bag I had stared at for weeks, the same primitive tool I had sworn wasn't enough. I watched her pump, hand over hand, desperate, knowing fatigue would come, knowing precision would falter. The boy's tiny chest rose and fell under her effort. But not enough, not for long. And then, the silence inside me broke. This was the moment. The moment I had feared, the moment I had begged for, the moment I couldn't run from. I looked at the nurse, the one who had brought me food on my worst night, and I didn't have to say a word. She knew. Her eyes widened. "You can't," she whispered. "Not without permission. If something goes wrong, if we do nothing, he dies," I said. And just like that, hesitation was a luxury we couldn't afford. We tore down the hall, heartbeats louder than the storm outside, to the storage room where my prototype sat in a locked cabinet. I had hidden it behind boxes of syringes and expired IV sets. Now, it was no longer a secret. Now, it was the only chance. We raced back, cradling a device the hospital had mocked, banned, laughed at, and laid it beside the boy. Every eye in the room turned toward me. Doctors, nurses, respiratory techs, all frozen in that single terrible decision. I placed the mask over the boy's mouth, connected the tubing, flipped the switch. The motor whirred to life. A soft hiss, then a breath. His chest rose. 1 second, 2, 3. His chest fell. Another hiss, another rise. His oxygen monitor ticked upward. No one spoke. Not a single sound except the rhythm of the machine. The rhythm of hope disguised as mechanics. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. The nurse who had been manually pumping just stared, tears gathering, her exhausted arms hanging useless at her sides. The boy's color returned slowly. Pink, not gray. The numbers kept climbing. 20 minutes in, one of the physicians finally broke the silence. "What is that?" he asked, voice barely more than a whisper. "A useless invention," I said, unable to hide the tremor in my voice. Or so I was told. Half an hour passed. The storm still raged. The hospital still fought to keep its lights alive. But in that one room, in that one fragile space, a life that should have been taken by the storm was quietly, stubbornly, beautifully breathing. And then came the sound I didn't expect. The sound I'd been denied for months. Applause. Not loud, not theatrical, but real. A slow, hesitant clap from a nurse, joined by another, and then another. Not for me, but for what they'd just witnessed. For the impossible that had just happened in front of them. By the time the boy stabilized enough to be transferred once power returned, the machine had been running for nearly 6 hours without a single fault. No jam, no overpressure, no failure, only breath, only life. I sat down on the floor outside the ER afterward, my legs refusing to hold me any longer. My hands shook. My chest ached with relief so deep it felt like pain. I'd gambled everything, my job, my reputation, my freedom, and for once the gamble had paid off. But even as joy rippled quietly through the staff, I knew what waited for me next. Questions, accusations, paperwork, maybe even lawyers. Because saving a life with an unapproved device doesn't erase the fact that it broke every rule in the book. Still, as I watched that boy sleep peacefully, connected to a machine born from sleepless nights and merciless ridicule, I realized something profound. The rules had been written to protect lives, and tonight, breaking them had done exactly that. Before we move on, I want to invite you. If you're still with me through this storm, this gamble, this heartbeat by heartbeat fight, tap that subscribe button. Because stories like this, they deserve to be heard. Not for fame, not for credit, but so no one, anywhere, has to watch helplessly again when help could have been built with courage and persistence. Morning came like judgment. The storm had passed, but in its place came a different kind of turbulence, one that wore ties and carried clipboards. I was summoned before I'd even left my shift, not for congratulations, not for a handshake, for an incident review. The boy was alive, stable, breathing on his own. But my career? That wasn't breathing at all. It was in triage, bleeding credibility by the minute. They sat me at the end of a long table. 6 faces stared back. Administration, risk management, legal, even the hospital director himself. The same man who had laughed at me months ago now stared as if I were both a liability and a curiosity. He began without ceremony. "You used an unauthorized device on a patient." "Yes," I said. "You understand that could have resulted in catastrophic harm?" "Yes." "You understand you've put this hospital in a legally indefensible position?" "Yes." I could feel my pulse in my throat, but I didn't flinch. I had no defense but the only one that mattered. "The boy is alive," I said quietly. The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. One of the legal reps cleared her throat. "Alive," she repeated almost reluctantly. "But how long has this device been in development?" 8 months. "And it has been tested?" I slid a binder across the table. My notes, my logs, my stress tests, airflow data, battery endurance records. Every sleepless night had left its mark on paper, not just in memory. They flipped through the pages, and for the first time, no one laughed. The director leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed not with ridicule but with something new. Calculation. This worked, he said finally. Not a question. A statement. It worked, I confirmed. And you've done all this on your own? Not entirely. I had help. 2 colleagues, off the clock. They believed in it when no one else would. Another silence. This one, different. Not hostile, not warm, just cautious. Like standing on a frozen lake, testing each step. Finally, the director exhaled, long and slow. You put this hospital at risk, he said. I know. You violated multiple policies. I know. You may have saved a life we could not have otherwise saved. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. He folded his hands. Leave the device with us. No more using it without clearance. We'll call a board meeting. We'll evaluate next steps. It wasn't a victory. Not yet. But it wasn't the termination I had braced for. It was a crack in the wall. Small, fragile, but real. By the next week, word had spread quietly through the hospital. Not officially, not in memos or press releases, but in whispers. The ICU charge nurse pulled me aside. That boy's parents, they know. They said thank you. They said you gave them back their son. A respiratory therapist. I saw the logs. That machine held stable pressure the entire time, no fluctuations. A surgeon, normally too busy to speak to anyone below his rank, stopped me in the hallway. If that thing works as well as they're saying, he murmured, you may have just changed the game. And then came the meeting. A formal review. Department heads, ethics board, engineering consultants. And there I was, suddenly the center of a conversation I hadn't been invited to for months. They grilled me, as they should have. They questioned materials, failure risks, contamination protocols, regulatory hurdles. I answered every question with the truth. No funding, no formal lab, only relentless testing, iteration, and human desperation turned into design. By the end of the meeting, the chief of medicine spoke. I don't care where it came from. I care that it worked, and I care that we can't ignore it. The hospital director didn't laugh this time. He nodded once sharply. Get this through proper approval, he said. If it holds up, we'll back it. It wasn't the apology I had once dreamed of, but in its place came something far better. Acceptance. Within weeks, a small pilot program was authorized, supervised trials under controlled conditions. What had once been hidden behind boxes of expired IV sets now sat in sterilized rooms, tagged, logged, evaluated. Doctors who had mocked me now requested demonstrations. The very same director who'd called my work useless introduced me to visiting faculty with a new label. The colleague who may have saved our last storm patient when we were out of options. Not praise, not glory, but respect. The quiet kind, the kind that mattered. And then came the call that would change everything. Another hospital, 2 cities over, heard the story. They had suffered a generator failure during an outbreak. They needed portable, low-cost ventilation. Now, our director, once my biggest barrier, looked at me across his desk. They want 3 units, he said. I blinked. 3? He nodded. You think you can build them? I smiled, not because I was confident. Because for the first time, I wasn't alone. The same people who had doubted me now wanted in. Engineers, nurses, techs, all leaning in, not away. The invention was no longer mine. It was ours. That was the turning point. The moment ridicule became curiosity, curiosity became respect, and respect became demand. But it wasn't just about machines anymore. It was about possibility, about what happens when someone refuses to let laughter be the final verdict, about what happens when a single act of defiance, born of compassion, drags the future into the present, no matter how many doors had to be kicked open on the way. Before I take you into the final stretch, where this invention left our walls and began to save lives across continents, I'm asking you right now to share this story. Hit like, drop a comment, send it to someone who needs to hear that being laughed at isn't the end. It might be the first sign you're onto something worth fighting for. What began in one dimly lit storage room did not stay there. At first, it spread like a rumor. Whispered from one hospital to another, a quiet suggestion shared between colleagues at conferences, during emergency calls, in back-channel emails. Then came the first official transfer. 3 units shipped across the city, each packed in unassuming plastic cases, labeled experimental support devices. They didn't have sleek branding. They didn't have corporate backing. But they had one thing no other device in their price range could offer. Proof. Every patient saved became another line of evidence. Every night a nurse slept with less fear of manual fatigue became another argument in its favor. The data kept piling up, and with it, the interest. Soon, requests began arriving faster than we could fill them. A hospital in the mountains, cut off by seasonal floods. A clinic on the outskirts of a war zone, where power grids were more fantasy than reality. Pediatric wards in places where ventilators were scarce, and babies died not from disease, but from lack of breath. We built as fast as we could. Then, someone from the engineering school saw what we were doing and offered a production partnership. No longer were we soldering wires by hand, praying every bolt held. Now, Machines began shaping the future we had dreamed of. And with that shift came something unexpected. Recognition, not in the form of trophies or ceremonies, but in invitations. Calls from ministries of health, emails from NGOs, partnerships with global health alliances that had ignored my proposals when they were only words, but now saw them as undeniable reality. The machine got a name, not a technical serial number, but a human name, chosen by the parents of the boy whose life had been the first proof of concept. They called it Second Breath. Within a year, Second Breath units were in dozens of hospitals. Within 3, they were on 4 continents. They ran in refugee camps, in disaster zones, in rural clinics where power outages weren't rare emergencies, they were daily life. Doctors began writing papers about it. Medical journals that wouldn't even read my letters now published studies validating its safety, its efficiency, its impact. Suddenly, the same administrators who had once warned me to keep my head down were standing beside me in press photos, shaking hands with health ministers, presenting grants for mass deployment. But the part that stayed with me, the part no grant, no headline could ever replace, were the stories that came back. A midwife in South Asia writing to say that 3 newborns survived a respiratory crisis because the device kept them breathing until a transport helicopter arrived. An email from a military medic describing how it bought precious time for soldiers trapped in collapsed buildings. A voice message from a father, his words breaking into tears, simply saying, "You never knew my daughter, but because of what you built, she's here. Thank you." Thousands of lives. Not hypotheticals, not statistics, not projections, real, breathing, laughing, stubborn lives that had stared at death and been pulled back by something once called useless. The irony never escaped me. The laughter that once cut me like a knife had become the echo that fueled me. Every time I thought about giving up, I remembered that sound, and I remembered how wrong it had been. And the hospital director, the one who had sat at the end of the table, the one whose smirk I had burned into my memory, he eventually asked to meet privately. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "No audience, no cameras. You were right, I was wrong. I should have listened." I told him the truth. "You gave me the greatest gift you could have, even if you didn't mean to. You gave me doubt, and doubt forced me to build something so strong no one could question it." He nodded slowly, then, for the first time since we met, smiled without arrogance. "It's saving more people than I ever thought possible," he said, "and you did it. But the truth is, I didn't do it alone. I never had. It took courage, yes, but also help. A nurse who believed, an engineer who joined quietly, parents who trusted, doctors who swallowed pride and chose hope over hierarchy. What we built together wasn't just a machine. It was a reminder that innovation doesn't always wear a lab coat, that sometimes the future is born not in billion-dollar labs but in moments of unbearable loss turned into stubborn refusal. That's what global impact really is. Not the headlines, not the awards. It's the quiet, everyday miracles. A breath taken where none should have been possible. A life continued. A future restored. Now, whenever I visit a hospital that uses Second Breath, I watch from a distance. I see a nurse connect it to a patient. I watch the chest rise. I listen to the rhythmic hiss. And I think about how close this all came to dying in a desk drawer under paperwork stamped not approved. So let me say this. To anyone who's ever been told their idea is foolish, useless, impossible, maybe it is. Maybe it's all 3. Until the day it isn't. Maybe the laughter you hear isn't the sound of rejection. Maybe it's the first sign that you've stepped somewhere new, somewhere uncomfortable, somewhere necessary. If you're watching this, if you've stayed through every beat of this story, I want you to know this isn't just a story about machines or hospitals. It's a story about the power of one person refusing to look away. About what happens when ordinary people hold the line until others finally see what they saw all along. And if you believe in stories like this, in persistence, in possibility, in hope disguised as defiance, then please subscribe, share, let this message travel as far as the machine itself did. Because somewhere, someone's being laughed at right now, and what they're building might just save your life next. If you've stayed with me through every twist, every storm, every quiet, desperate night, then you already know this isn't just my story. It never was. It's the story of how the world often meets change, not with open arms, but with closed doors, not with applause, but with laughter. It's the story of how easy it is to dismiss something that doesn't fit the mold, how simple it is to wave off a dream with a single word. Useless. But here's the truth I learned the hard way. What's called useless today may be the only thing standing between life and death tomorrow. That machine, that laughable little box with its wires and its motor and its stubborn heartbeat of compressed air, now hums quietly in places I've never been, helping people I'll never meet. It's no longer mine. It belongs to the nurses who use it, the parents who pray over it, the children who grow up because of it. Sometimes I think back to that night, the storm, the boy, the moment I chose action over safety. I wonder what would have happened if I had stayed silent, if I had let fear of losing my job, of being mocked, of failing, keep me from trying. Would that boy have survived? With thousands after him? Would anyone even know what we've lost? That question keeps me awake some nights. Not with regret, but with a strange kind of gratitude. Because now I know, courage isn't loud. It's quiet. It's lonely. It's the voice inside you that says, do it anyway, when every other voice says, don't. That voice, it's worth listening to. If you're watching this, you might not be building a machine. You might not work in medicine. You might not even think of yourself as an inventor. But somewhere inside you, there's an idea. A better way. A way forward that no one else can see yet. And maybe the world will laugh. Maybe they'll doubt. Maybe they'll tell you to stop before you start. Don't. Because the world doesn't need more people who wait for permission. It needs people who move when the window is only an inch open, who hold on when everyone else lets go, who believe pretty stubbornly, quietly, relentlessly, until belief becomes proof. That's what saved those lives. Not brilliance, not funding, just refusal. Refusal to accept that impossible was the final word. So here's mine, to you. Whatever it is you're dreaming of, keep going. It won't be easy. And in that moment, it won't be fast. Every sleepless night, but one day someone will look at what you built, every door that refused to let die, and they'll say the same words I've now heard in hospitals across the world. Because there's nothing, thank you, absolutely nothing that compares to knowing someone is alive today who wouldn't have been, except for what you did. So as I close this chapter, I leave you with this simple truth. The next life-changing idea might not come from a boardroom or a research lab. It might be sitting in someone's garage, in a basement, in a cluttered apartment, hidden under doubt and ridicule. Maybe it's yours, and if it is, fight for it. Because you never know. One day the world might stop laughing and start breathing because of you. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story moved you, if it gave you even a spark of hope, then share it. Subscribe if you haven't already. Help me keep telling stories like this. Stories of people who refuse to let the world stay the way it was. Because sometimes, all it takes to save thousands of lives is one person brave enough to keep going when everyone else turns away.